Some ancient objects were not myths. They were tools, and no one alive remembers how to build them. A bronze wheel predicts eclipses 1,000 years before such machines were supposed to exist. A blade holds an edge no smith of its century could explain. And one shape, cast in bronze, still has no name for what it did. The Antikythera Mechanism, off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, sponge divers sheltering from a storm found an ancient shipwreck instead. Alongside marble statues and bronze coins, they pulled up a corroded, fist-sized lump that sat labeled and mostly ignored in an Athens museum for decades. Generations of students were taught that geared machines began with medieval and Renaissance clockmakers. But everything changed in 2006, when researcher Tony Freeth and a team of scientists ran the fragment through a high-resolution CT scanner. Inside the corrosion, they found more than 30 interlocking bronze gears, cut with a precision nothing else from the ancient world comes close to. The device tracked the sun, the moon, and the planets, predicted eclipses years in advance, and counted down to the next Olympic Games. It had likely been built sometime between 150 and 100 years before Christ, decades before the ship that carried it sank on a voyage toward Rome. That textbook timeline for geared machines was wrong by more than 1,000 years. The next machine built with gears this fine belongs to European clockmakers, working more than a millennium later. Baghdad's Buried Battery. A set of sealed clay jars sat buried near the village of Kujut Rabu, close to the ancient Iraqi capital of Ctesiphon, until construction workers broke into the tomb holding them in 1936. Inside one was a copper cylinder wrapped around an iron rod, sealed shut with tar. The jars dated to the Parthian or early Sasanian period, somewhere between 250 years before Christ and 650 after. Wilhelm Koenig, who ran the antiquities lab at the National Museum of Iraq, cataloged the jar like dozens of others before it, but he noticed the copper and iron never touched, kept apart the way a modern battery keeps its terminals apart. And in 1938, he proposed something no one expected. The jars were ancient galvanic cells, filled with vinegar or wine, used to electroplate gold onto silver. Old television specials repeated that theory as settled fact long after archaeologists had moved on. No gold-plated object from this period has ever turned up made with a method like it. Similar jars found nearby held only rolled papyrus, suggesting a religious use instead. The jar still sits behind glass, corroded and empty. Whether it once carried a tiny electric charge or a whispered blessing is still an open argument among the people who study it. The Nimrud Lens. Assyrian astronomers working at Nimrud, in what is now northern Iraq, kept exact written records of eclipses and planetary movement, precise enough that modern astronomers can still check their dates against ours today. In 1850, British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard's team, clearing the ruins of an Assyrian palace there, uncovered a small oval disc of ground rock crystal among thousands of carved ivories and seals. It was rough on one side and ground smooth and slightly convex on the other, dated to roughly the 8th century before Christ. At first, it was catalogued as decoration, one polished stone among many. But in 1852, Scottish physicist David Brewster examined the disc and argued its curve matched the shape used to grind a basic magnifying lens, the same kind of glass that once sat in desk drawers and sewing boxes, capable of bringing small text or distant objects into sharper focus. If it really worked as a lens, it would push the invention of optical glass back roughly 2,000 years earlier than history books allow. Most archaeologists still call it an ornament rather than Brewster's lens. Either way, the astronomers who once worked in that palace left records accurate enough to hold up today, with or without a piece of ground crystal to help them see. Crete's unread disc. In 1908, Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier was excavating the Minoan palace of Phaistos on the island of Crete when he uncovered a small disc of fired clay, stamped on both sides with symbols arranged in a tight, unbroken spiral. More than 200 symbol impressions cover the disc, pressed with carved stamps into wet clay before it was fired, an approach unlike any other writing system found in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. But when linguists sat down to read it, they made no progress at all, and nobody has gotten past that point since. In 1952, architect Michael Ventris famously cracked Linear B, a script from the same island every expert of the day called just as unreadable. Scholars expected the Phaistos Disc to fall next. It never did. The symbols match no known script from the same era, and no second disc with a matching spiral has ever been found to compare it against. No one has read a single sentence of it. Some believe the symbols spell out a religious hymn, a calendar, or a legal contract. The strangest theory, and one several researchers still take seriously, is that the disc may simply be an ancient board game, meaning the oldest undeciphered message on Earth might not be a message at all. Roman dodecahedra. A trowel struck bronze in a Roman rubbish pit near the village of Norton Disney in Lincolnshire, England, in the summer of 2023. The volunteer digging there, Richard Watts, had found a dodecahedron, a hollow 12-sided object with a circular hole of a different size in every face, the 33rd example ever recovered in Britain. But this was not a new mystery. Roughly 130 of these objects have turned up across the Northern Roman Empire, from Britain to Hungary, and not one shows up in a single Roman text, painting, or mosaic. They vary wildly in size and metal, most showing no wear from tools or hands, ruling out early guesses like candle holders or dice. One leading theory ties them to religious ritual, buried on purpose and never meant to be used. A competing camp still holds out for a practical role never pinned down. Archaeologists have studied these objects for nearly 300 years, since the first one turned up in England in 1739, and every explanation offered since has eventually been buried by a new find that does not fit it. The most carefully made object on this list may be the one thing on it that still has no story to go with it. The Ulfberht swords. Decades before streaming shows turned Vikings into television heroes, metallurgists were already finding something stranger hiding in their swords. Scattered across river finds and museum collections in Germany, Scandinavia, and France, sit roughly 170 Viking-age blades, each one carrying the same name, Ulfberht, inlaid in iron wire along the blade. For years, historians assumed it was simply a maker's mark, unremarkable beyond its odd spelling. But when metallurgist Alan Williams at the Wallace Collection in London cut sections from dozens of these blades and studied them under a microscope, he found something that did not belong in 9th century Europe. The genuine Ulfberht blades were forged from a single, unusually pure block of high-carbon crucible steel, evenly structured from edge to edge, the kind of steel European bloomery furnaces of the period simply could not produce. The likely source was thousands of miles away, in crucible steel workshops across Central Asia, reaching Viking territory along the Volga trade route. The swords were made only between roughly 800 and 1000 years after Christ, and production stopped at almost exactly the same time that river route closed to Viking traffic. No one can say how different Viking Age warfare might have looked if that eastern supply line had stayed open a century longer. Steel no one could copy. From around the 4th century before Christ, smiths in southern India were producing a rare form of steel known as woots, smelted in sealed clay crucibles at temperatures that left the metal marked with a rippling, water-like pattern. Traders carried woots ingots west along caravan routes into the Middle East, where blacksmiths in cities like Damascus forged them into swords known for holding an edge far longer than most blades of their era. But sometime around the middle of the 1700s, the supply of true woots ingots stopped arriving, and the technique for making it vanished with the last smiths who understood it. For more than 2 centuries afterward, no one could explain what made the steel so exceptional. In 2006, German physicist Peter Pofler examined a genuine woots blade under an electron microscope and found carbon nanotubes embedded directly in the steel's structure, an arrangement that reinforces the metal at a scale no hammer or naked eye could ever control. Modern labs can now identify exactly what woots steel contains, but growing that same structure by hand, inside a red-hot crucible, the way ancient smiths once did, is a trick modern metallurgy still has not matched. Rome's self-healing concrete. The dome of the Pantheon in Rome, poured in the 2nd century after Christ, is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth. Along the Italian coast, Roman harbor walls built under the early empire still stand after 2,000 years of constant battering by seawater. Modern marine concrete, by comparison, often starts cracking and crumbling within a few decades of standing in salt water. For a long time, engineers assumed the ancient recipe simply used better raw materials, without understanding why it worked. But in 2017, geologist Marie Jackson at the University of Utah analyzed samples pulled from Roman harbor ruins and found the actual reason. Seawater seeping into the mixture reacts with volcanic ash inside it, growing a rare mineral called aluminous tobermarite, a crystal structure that reinforces the concrete instead of breaking it down. The longer Roman marine concrete sits in the ocean, the stronger parts of it become. Modern concrete does the opposite. It is an open question how many seawalls, piers, and coastal foundations built in the last century might still be standing today if that Roman formula had never been lost. The Dendera Light myth. Deep inside the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, a stone relief carved during the Ptolemaic or early Roman period shows a long, oval shape with a snake curling inside it, connected to a stem that rests on a small pillar. In 1968, Swiss author Erich von Däniken pointed to this exact carving in his book Chariots of the Gods, arguing it showed an electric light bulb, snake as filament, pillar as base, proof that Egyptians had wired their temples for power. The idea spread through bestseller lists and the kind of late-night television specials this generation grew up watching, and it still turns up in documentaries and posters today. Egyptologists had already read the hieroglyphs around the carving, and those texts describe something else entirely, a lotus flower giving rise to a serpent, a well-known scene from Egyptian creation mythology that appears almost identically on temple walls across Egypt, with no wiring implied anywhere nearby. The same lotus and serpent image shows up on papyri and tomb paintings centuries older than Dendera, long before anyone claims Egypt had electricity to hide. The temple's own walls explain the carving, a story about how life began, told in stone for 2,000 years. The half-million-year spark plug. 3 rock hunters, Wallace Lane, Virginia Maxey, and Mike Mikesell, were searching the Coso Mountains near Olancha, California, for geodes to sell in their gift shop, when, on February 13, 1961, one stone in their sack turned out to hold something stranger than crystal. Cutting it open, Mikesell's diamond saw blade snapped, and instead of crystal, he found a smooth porcelain cylinder wrapped around a thin shaft of magnetic metal. A geologist the group consulted estimated the surrounding rock had taken roughly 500,000 years to form. Newspapers and radio picked up the story fast, calling it proof of a lost civilization with electrical technology thousands of years ahead of its time, the kind of headline that ran beside the moon race in the evening papers. In 1969, researcher Ronald Caillet X-rayed the object and matched its structure almost exactly to a champion spark plug, a common design sold across the country in the 1920s. The likely explanation was simple: a decades-old spark plug, sealed inside a hardened mineral crust far faster than anyone expected. But the object itself vanished from public view soon after, last known sitting in Wallace Lane's living room, never tested again, so the 1969 verdict has never technically been double-checked. If you like this video, subscribe for more like it.